What would you do if your neighbor stepped outside and started violently breakdancing without stopping for a week? You would probably call the cops to have them safely restrained. In 1518, the city of Strasbourg decided to build a wooden stage, hire a band, and watch them dance until their hearts exploded. It sounds like a myth, but it is terrifyingly real. It started on a sweltering July morning with a motivated woman named Frau Trophäa. She walked outside, ignored her husband, and simply began to twirl in the silent street. There was no music. There was just Frau Trophäa engaging in a solo rave that should have ended after a few hours of exhaustion. It didn't.
Bro, skip the DJ.
Frau Trophäa danced for a full day, then a second, and a third. The skin on her feet blistered and bled onto the dirt, leaving a horrific trail of red footprints. Her husband begged her to stop, but she was unreachable, trapped in an invisible rhythm. You assumed the townspeople would carry her to a bed and tie her down for safety. Instead, the bizarre spectacle became violently contagious. Within a week, 34 people looked at this bleeding woman and decided joining her was a fantastic idea. It was a psychological virus tearing through the peasantry. The government was forced to step in. You would think the authorities would bring order to the chaos. You would be totally wrong.
TikTok trends were wild.
Strasbourg's esteemed city council panicked at the sight of dozens of peasants aggressively jigging in the streets. They quickly consulted the finest medical minds of the 16th century, which was like asking a guy with a jar of leeches about complex neurology. The doctors stroked their beards, observed the thrashing citizens, and confidently declared the official diagnosis: hot blood. They believed the dancers' brains were literally overheating like faulty engines. The scientifically backed cure for an exhausted person rapidly dancing themselves to death? More dancing. They prescribed continuous movement to burn off the toxic hot blood. This is exactly where the council made their most fatal, gloriously stupid mistake.
Science was basically vibes.
Instead of tying these delirious people to beds, the city used taxpayer money to fund a massive, involuntary dance floor. They cleared out a grain market, constructed a heavy wooden stage, and corralled the bleeding, aggressively sleep-deprived citizens onto it. It was a medieval rave organized by the government, designed entirely as a legitimate medical treatment. But it obviously gets significantly worse. You can't have a proper rave without a beat, so the government literally hired professional musicians to keep the tempo up. They successfully transformed a localized psychological crisis into a government-mandated marathon of pure physical torture. You would assume the constant screaming was the absolute worst part. It really wasn't.
Worst Vipe section ever.
Imagine the suffocating smell of that packed town square. It was the dead of July, and hundreds of unwashed peasants were sweating profusely, crying out in sheer agony and begging for sleep while a paid professional aggressively played the lute in their faces. The musicians actively increased the tempo to force the heat out of their blood faster. The blood from their ruined feet made the wooden stage slippery, turning the treatment into a hazardous slip and slide of gore. And then, exactly what you would expect to happen, finally happened. The first dancer dropped to the wooden floorboards. They didn't fall from simple fatigue, they dropped dead from a massive coronary event. You would think the first dead body would be a wake-up call. Guess again.
Play Freebird, you coward.
The sudden introduction of literal death only made the entire situation infinitely worse. By the end of the blistering month, over 400 people were caught in this inescapable, nightmarish conga line. The mortality rate absolutely spiked. Historical reports claim they were losing roughly 15 people every single day to sudden strokes, explosive heart attacks, and sheer physical exhaustion. That is 15 human beings dropping dead a day from the simple act of dancing. The local gravediggers were suddenly working forced overtime, hauling away twisted bodies still wearing ruined shoes. The hot blood theory was clearly failing spectacularly. What exactly do you do when your genius medical cure actively becomes a mass casualty event?
Keep the beat dropping.
You instantly double down, but you quickly change administrative departments to avoid the blame. The city council quietly fired the medical doctors and immediately called in the religious priests. If it wasn't a biological problem, it obviously had to be a terrifying spiritual one. The Catholic clergy observed the carnage and decided the dancers were victims of the divine wrath of Saint Vitus. Saint Vitus was a patron saint who apparently loved to punish arrogant sinners by forcing them to violently hit the griddy until their internal organs failed. It was a brilliant political pivot to just blame a dead saint for the city's incompetence. Appeasing an angry, dance-obsessed saint requires a completely different strategy. The music stopped, but the horror didn't.
St. Vitus was petty.
The brand new government mandate was to completely ban all public dancing, upbeat music, and even casual gambling, just in case St. Vitus aggressively hated rolling dice too. But what about the 400 people who were still violently jigging in the middle of the blood-stained town square? The priests mandated a holy road trip. They aggressively herded these delirious, uncontrollable dancing zombies onto a fleet of wooden wagons. Imagine a rickety cart filled to the brim with people who absolutely cannot stop twitching against the wood, being slowly wheeled through the scenic French countryside. They were being transported to a specific shrine located deep inside a dark mountain cave. The medical cure was downgraded to an exorcism by sheer exhaustion.
Worst Uber ride alive.
When the horrific wagon fleet finally arrived at the dark shrine in Saverne, the religious ritual waiting for them was deeply bizarre. Priests grabbed the violently thrashing dancers, forced small wooden crosses into their trembling hands, and shoved their bleeding feet into bright red shoes that had been heavily sprinkled with holy water and blessed oil. Yes, bright red shoes. The religious symbolism was about as subtle as a flying brick to the face. The dancers were forcefully led around a wooden altar, still violently jerking, while priests loudly chanted Latin prayers begging the saint to chill out. It looked significantly less like a solemn ceremony and a lot more like a weird cult initiating twitching marathon runners. And here is the truly infuriating part.
Gucci holy water kicks.
The ridiculous red shoe ritual actually started working. After several agonizing weeks of pure physical torment, after dozens of preventable deaths, and after the exhausted musicians packed up, the survivors slowly began to calm down. The violent twitching finally stopped. The manic, terrifying energy slowly faded from their glassy eyes. They collapsed in massive, sobbing heaps on the cold stone floor of the shrine, finally allowed to just close their eyes and sleep. The catastrophic dancing plague simply burned itself out. Was it the magical holy water? Was it the symbolic red shoes? Absolutely not. It was just the fragile human body finally reaching the absolute biological limit of physical endurance before forcefully entering a protective coma. They just let their internal batteries run completely dry.
Unplugged and plugged back.
So what actually happened in the streets of Strasbourg in 1518? Scientists have spent decades desperately trying to ruin the horrific fun with boring logic. Some researchers claim it was ergot poisoning, a toxic mold found on rye wheat that causes muscle spasms and hallucinations. Basically, accidental medieval LSD. But taking LSD doesn't usually make you do synchronized, agonizing cardio for a month straight. Other historians argue it was a massive psychogenic illness, a severe hysterical breakdown caused by famine, rampant disease, and the general misery of being alive in the 1500s. Basically, their fragile brains collectively broke, and their bodies subconsciously decided that violently dancing into an early grave was the only logical response to a genuinely terrible economy.
Relatable coping mechanism, honestly.
Whatever the scientifically proven cause was, the dancing plague stands as a monumental, bloody testament to sheer human absurdity. A lone woman started stepping in the dirt. And a month later, the local government successfully funded a lethal, taxpayer-subsidized disco that wiped out a significant percentage of the city's population. It flawlessly proves that when faced with an unprecedented crisis, authority figures will absolutely make the worst possible decision, aggressively double down on it, and instantly blame a ghost when people start dying. Frau Troffea's name permanently went down in history as patient zero of the single most ridiculous, poorly managed epidemic ever recorded by mankind. Humanity hasn't seen anything quite like it since. Well, at least until Zumba was tragically invented.
Zumba is definitely cursed.
If you enjoyed this absurd chapter of human history, don't forget to like and subscribe. Click the top left video to explore another unbelievable historical failure. We'll see you in the next disaster. Thanks for watching.